Yeah, we're on. Yep. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day. I hope everybody had a wonderful time last night. I am, as most of you know already, Peter Webster, just one of the small but mighty team of organizers, but I'll be getting things going this morning. But to start off, I'm going to give Andre Tessier a moment to speak from Clairvate, who very kindly hosted the breakfast this morning.
Okay, good morning. Oh, thank you. Okay. Good morning, everyone. How was breakfast? All right? Yeah, good. So yeah, I was really excited to be able to sponsor the breakfast this morning. As you know, COVID really put the brakes on these types of events, and it's important for us to be able to get together and spend time collaborating and sharing ideas. So very thankful that we're able to do this again. And I've been doing a few of these this summer, although this is the first one we've sponsored. So I was very excited to have that opportunity to be able to sponsor this event. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the important work that you're doing, and really just enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. Yeah, so welcome to everybody in the room, and of course, welcome to the guys online. I'm really pleased with the turnout we've had on Zoom. But I want to begin by acknowledging, of course, that we're meeting in a place called Chubuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by treaties of peace and friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet peoples signed with the British Crown in 1725. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules that will be on an ongoing relationship between nations. So we are all treaty people. I don't know, any other announcements, Jen, before... Okay, so our first item of business is the David Binkley Memorial Lecture. David was a highly respected Canadian systems librarian and a regular participant in Access, going back, I think, almost to its inception. When he died in 2005, this lecture in his honor was intended to bring different perspectives to Access. In the last several years, the lecture has been sponsored by OCLC, and I'm going to turn it over to Andy Spilioe to announce this year's Binkley lecture speaker, Cynthia Bruce. So, Andy, over to you. Or you want to work from up there?
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Spilioe with OCLC. I'm very happy to introduce our keynote speaker. Cynthia Bruce is an associate professor of music therapy and chair of the Department of Creative Arts Therapies at Concordia University in Montreal. As a blind activist scholar working at the intersection of critical disability studies, music therapy, and education, she works to mobilize lived disability knowledge to expose systemic inequity and formulate more just approaches to research and practice. She focuses on accessibility in higher education and on self-advocacy as essential lived knowledge that can generate deep understandings of inequity and elucidate possibilities for progressive change. Dr. Bruce recently co-led the development of a comprehensive set of recommendations for an accessibility standard in education in Nova Scotia and is a collaborator with the Canadian Accessibility Network. She is a 2022 recipient of the Concordia University Petro-Canada Young Innovator Award for her project titled Lockdown to Teach and Learn, a critical disability studies analysis of disabled student and faculty experience in the age of COVID-19. Let's welcome Cynthia Bruce.
Microphone. Okay. Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Can the folks online hear I'm a little worried about the Zoom folks.
Just giving you the thumbs up.
A thumbs up, fantastic. Okay. Jenna,
Give you a 3-minute warning when you're.
okay,
getting
yell at
close.
me.
Yeah.
Don't wave at me.
You're right.
So if you want your slides to advance, just say next slide.
Perfect. So are we on the title slide?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Telling you, I love being a young innovator. At the age of 55, it feels great. They probably need to rename that. So it's so good to be home in Nova Scotia. I'm going to do the academic thing and probably over-explain my title slide. On True Confessions, I actually hate titles. I hate coming up with titles. It's probably the thing I feel most incompetent at doing. And I switched the title just before I sent these slides to Peter yesterday, but Access Adventures is sort of intended to capture the fact that I kind of never know what's coming at me. And I really do sort of live at the nexus of liberation and tribulation. Sometimes it's really amazing. Sometimes it's horrible. And most of the time I spend in the messy middle where I really never know what's going on, but I can kind of go along and get along. All right, so if we can go to the next slide. So just a little bit about me, lots of which was just shared with you in the introduction. I do want to acknowledge that Concordia University, where I now teach and live and learn and research, is actually in Jojage, which is in the Gunangahaga Nation, and the Gunangahaga are the custodians of the lands that we now know as Montreal. I identify really clearly as a blind activist, educator, scholar, researcher, teacher, agitator, probably many folks would say. And it's an important part of how I think about and talk about my work. So I think it's really important for me to talk about that. I work largely in researching and advocating for accessibility in post-secondary education. So I am a music therapist. I do teach in creative arts therapies and I'm their department chair, but I really focus on accessibility in higher education because I think it's the best way for us to have more diversified professions. I'm specifically interested in experiences of self-advocacy, and so that's where my doctoral research sat, and it's still what I'm really interested in looking at, and especially about what they tell us about the nature of our institutions as it relates to accessibility specifically. I have contributed, as you just heard, to the development of a comprehensive set of accessibility standards in education. In Nova Scotia, we're only the second province to look at education in terms of legislation and accessibility regulations. So that's sort of still in process. And we hope that that will make our institutions, both public and private, K-12 and post-secondary, much more accessible for a diversity of folks. Maybe importantly in this conference, almost everything I do day to day is supported by or involves technology use. It's not where I maybe anticipated being, because I would not necessarily say I was adept at technology use. My husband, who's here with me, rescues me from lots of situations. Slide. So what are we going to think about and talk about? And yes, I will solicit some perspectives from you as we go along. I want to talk a little bit about the why of my work. I'm sure it looks like I think about this a lot, but I've only recently been thinking about the why in those very specific terms instead of the what. And I think it's been really important to kind of refining how I work in post-secondary education. We're going to talk a little bit about access wins, advances, and epic fails. That's my favorite. Talk a little bit about my own engagement with access issues and our collective engagement with access issues. a little bit at some access definitions, just because I find them so interesting, and you may not, and I apologize if you don't, but it's just so interesting to, maybe I made an assumption that librarians might be interested in definitions. But as I looked at them, I thought, wow, this is more interesting than I anticipated in all the ways that we actually don't define access and accessibility. I'm going to talk a little bit about librarians and how they can and do help, because they've been some of the most helpful people in my work life in particular, and my doctoral life. So next slide, the why of my work. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot more lately, probably coincidentally, or maybe not, as I started to think about leadership, as I moved into the department chair role and sort of considered how I could best serve my colleagues. I started to think a lot about the why and what core belief or beliefs my work is connected to. And I think I always thought I had articulated that really well. And I think I'm realizing I've refined what I think and believe in some respects. So I believe strongly that the intentional integration of disabled ways of being, knowing, and doing is essential for the cultivation of welcoming, inclusive, and academically rigorous post-secondary institution environments. I don't think I had thought about that belief in that way before. And in some ways, it came out of some casual conversation with a colleague who is also a good friend and confidant in our sort of post-secondary adventures, Dr. Lynn Aylward at Acadia, who sort of jokingly said to me one day when I was trying to provide feedback about something in the institution, she sort of jokingly said, you people really need me. She said, that's what you need to tell them. And I didn't think a lot about that at that point. I think about that a lot more now. So I talk about my work, or the what of my work, as the commitment to amplifying disabled and minoritized voices, making visible the presence of ableism, and creating capacity for transformation. I really think about that as something that's important. But this is what has changed. Much of my work over the years has really centered the fight for recognition of disability rights in all kinds of domains, but for this purpose and in lots of my work life, post-secondary education. So the fight that says, I have a right to be here, you have a responsibility to make sure I can be here. And that's still what I do in lots of ways, except I feel like my why has helped me be a little more courageous, a little edgier, so that I can move on from just saying that I have a right to be here and you have a responsibility, to saying you really need me. You need us. You need our ways of working, our ways of being, our ways of knowing. If you really want to meaningfully live out your missions. Next slide. Okay, so I'm moving on to the slide that I call cave dweller tech. And this is to start thinking about sort of my lifelong engagement with access, growing up as low vision at the time with a progressive condition really has made me engage with technology for a long time. And I've been able to see it evolve in lots of really important ways. So my cave dweller tech moments were thinking back to when I was 10 years old in grade 4, and I started to need some print magnification. I was brought a CCTV, a closed circuit television. So not the piece of technology you want if you want to be cool and if you want to look like you fit in. You don't want to be seen from every angle of the room for everything that you do. It took up 2 desks. They did let me have someone to sit with me in my little desk configuration so that I didn't feel completely set off. And that was fun and not fun in all kinds of ways. but it was important. It was sort of the start of my engagement, I think, with access technology. I didn't think about it a lot beyond the clear optics that I hated as a 10-year-old, but it was the beginning of a long, long engagement with technology as a means for access and as a barrier to access in lots of ways. So in middle school and high school, photocopy enlargements became possible. It was great. It meant I had a test or a handout that I could see. I often had to wait while my teacher went and did it because they forgot to do it in advance. I often had these massive sheets of paper that were 3 sheets of paper taped together. So less than ideal, but at that point, being able to do it in that way was important to me, and they facilitated it. And it didn't have a lot of bureaucratic stuff attached to it. We just needed it done, and we did it. So that was great. So then as time went on, sort of through high school and early university years, and actually even my first graduate degree, I worked a lot with recorded texts. Early on, I had access through the Canadian National Institute for the Blind to lots of books on tape. But it was a slow process, and I didn't always get what I wanted. So I had a catalog, and I remember sitting there with Mom, and she would circle all of these book numbers of the kinds of books that I would really like to read. In the end, I got what I got, so I read what I got. So I didn't really anticipate, nor did I choose at the age of 10, 12, 14 to read, for example, The Northern Magus, all about Pierre Elliott Trudeau. 200 Days, the short-lived government of Joe Clark. Not really on the list of things, but it was what was available, and I really liked to read at night, so it's what I read. And, you know, I might not have read those books otherwise, and I'm sure I learned lots. Eventually, screen readers became available, which was great. Although for years and years and years, the screen readers could not pronounce my name, so I'm still known in my house as Cynthia, because that's how the screen readers pronounce my name. They became somewhat affordable. They're still expensive and sophisticated enough to be useful, particularly as an academic. So yes, there's lots of free screen readers available. They come on Macs, they come on Windows systems, but they're not generally robust enough to be useful for me, particularly as an academic. So then the next slide. So the next slide is what I hope is an image of the screen for CELA. So this is actually what that CNIB book service turned into. And I think I discovered it when I was teaching at Acadia, and I'm gonna say Maggie Nielsen, who I think spoke to you all yesterday, introduced me to it. And it was a game changer. Became a game changer even when I had to log into the website to order my book and then go to my phone and download the book to my separate. Now it's all integrated. And so from my phone, I get to search this massive CNIB library. It was the CNIB library, but it's now sort of expanded so that it's for folks with any print disability. I can search it. I can download my book in the format of my choice. And it's there in 10 to 15 minutes. And I don't have to read the Northern Magus anymore. So if I want to read Kristen Hanna, I can read Kristen Hanna. If I want to read something else more academic, I can get that as well. So this has really, really been a game changer in my life. Let's move to the next one. Okay, my iPhone. So that's not just a game changer, that is life-changing. That's been life-changing. I think on my slide is just an image of my home screen. So you don't get to see all my shopping apps. And there are many. I get lots of notifications from shopping apps. That's when I could shop on my own on a phone or on a website, it was just a huge I'd never been able to browse before in my life. It was really exciting. So this was life-changing in all kinds of ways. I discovered, interestingly, that iPhones were out of the box accessible, I'm going to say 10 years ago now, maybe even more, when I was working for the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities, and I was doing systemic advocacy, government relations work, doing that kind of work. And I had, interestingly, been negotiating with folks about funding for a screen reader that would make a BlackBerry accessible. So we're looking at all of these options, and it was going to cost $500, which I thought, I mean, BlackBerry didn't cost $500. The tech to make it accessible was going to cost $500 and it seemed ridiculous. So I'm working on my laptop one day because that had the screen reader technology, and I get an email from a colleague of mine who worked for the CNIB, and it said, "Sent from my iPhone." I thought, well, that's really strange. So I emailed him. I said, "I noticed at the bottom of your email, it said sent from my iPhone. How are you using an iPhone?" He writes back. He said, "Oh, didn't you know? iPhones are out of the box accessible." So at that point, I was probably locked into a 2-year contract with my silly BlackBerry. I can't even remember how we resolved that one. But by the time I started my PhD in 2011, I had my first iPhone 3. And it was so exciting. It changed my world in so many ways. Did you know people actually make lists of things to do in the run of a day, and then they can actually cross them off their lists? I could never do that. Did you know people put things in a calendar so that they know when to do them? I could never do that. So this gave me the capacity, texting is great, social media is great, but the everyday tasks that this made so much easier were immeasurable. I carried everything around in my head because I had to. I didn't have another choice. And I, prayed to the gods every day that I didn't forget something or get the date wrong or the time wrong of a meeting. So the iPhone really, in all kinds of ways, has been a game changer. And now, as department chair, I'm noticing all of the ways that I probably couldn't do my job very easily without it. The calendar that will integrate my department calendar with my faculty calendar, with the calendar from the provost's office with critical dates for the year. It's really changed my ability to do my job in ways that I never imagined, and just to engage in life. So that's been one of the amazing technology advances that's really been all good. And the fact that Apple takes it seriously enough, and I know there's lots of proprietary issues around Apple, but this is one thing they've done incredibly well. Next slide, please. All right. So Zoom chat. So the folks on Zoom, sorry, I'm not denigrating your mode of participation. And Zoom has done all kinds of things for me. But when I talk about Zoom chat, in particular, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I mean it. It's so I'm thankful for Zoom in all kinds of ways. When I first was offered the job at Concordia, it was coincidentally the day we went into lockdown here in Nova Scotia. I just shook my head and thought, what have I done? But Zoom enabled me to teach from Nova Scotia for 2 years. So I started at Concordia in August of 2020, and we moved in June of 2022. So it really made a difference. I couldn't imagine how I was going to move and start to orient in Montreal in the context of COVID, where all of a sudden distancing was a requirement, and I couldn't see if people were distanced. I couldn't see if people were masked. It was an aspect of access that I had not thought a lot about before we had to contend with COVID, and I'm sure I'm not the only person. So Zoom made it possible for me to engage with my colleagues, for me to take up this job in ways that allowed me to feel safe, but still engaged, to become part of the department when everybody else was on Zoom. So we were all initially at least working in the same way. So it was fantastic. Zoom wasn't perfect. It still isn't. There are still things that are quite difficult for me when I work with a screen reader. So sharing my screen sort of variably works and doesn't work. I noticed yesterday that when somebody else shares their screen and particularly shares their computer system audio, apparently knocks out all my access to all the controls in Zoom. So I can't raise my hand or lower my hand. I can't mute and unmute. I can't reach the chat. So there's all kinds of ways that that doesn't work so well. The chat is great and not great. So we've talked interestingly about the chat as being a real accessibility win, and it is. So folks can participate, particularly in teaching and learning contexts, in ways that are comfortable for them. For me, it gets really difficult because as I'm trying to talk and maybe do something like this, I'm always getting the chats in my ear and trying to keep track of questions perhaps and not lose important things that people are raising. So that's been a little difficult to navigate, I would say. That's been a little bit of the ugly. I often find I'm in webinars that I'm not hosting, and there's so much going on in the chat that I can't always seem to turn off, that I can't listen to the speaker. I have to try and constantly figure out how to silence the chat. So it's been good. It's been bad. It's been a little bit ugly in some contexts, but overall, meaningful, I would say, access advancement for all kinds of reasons. I would say the downside is, and this is not unique to me, everybody schedules meetings now back to back. And we don't get a minute for a break at all. Okay, next slide, please. So Kurzweil 1000. So on my laptop for my everyday, I use a screen reader package called JAWS, which is, and yes, the little symbol is a little shark, I think. And its little assistant is called Sharky. So it's pretty robust. It's built for blind users. It is what most blind users tend to install. It's not cheap, but it's been around a while and they've worked out, I would say, lots of the kinks. But it doesn't do everything well. And one of the things initially that it didn't do well was PDFs. Now I have sort of an OCR converter, and so if I get an inaccessible PDF, it'll do something with it. So I started off using Kurzweil, and I have a description here on the slide from the website that says, Kurzweil 1000 is an advanced reading tool for people who are blind or severely visually impaired. It works on a personal computer in conjunction with a flatbed scanner and synthetic speech to convert the printed word into speech with highly accurate optical character recognition and crisp synthetic speech in an integrated package. So, and it says it's easy to use for beginners. It's got lots of features. So I found it useful for academic reading, but the interesting way that this showed up as a technology that kind of rescued me during my dissertation was connected actually to data analysis. So, and I didn't really think this through. I think most of us enter into PhDs not really knowing what we're in for. And so you take it one step at a time. And I hadn't really thought about data analysis a whole lot until I got to the point where I had 47 interviews that had been transcribed. And I thought, oh boy, how am I going to do this? I really wanted to be able to work with recordings. It's how I connect with participants. I remember their voices and I remember the inflection of their voices when we're in conversation. So I wanted to preserve that connection. So I was excited about all of the new qualitative data analysis software because I thought it's great. I can upload those recordings. You can do some coding and transcription within them. Yeah, no, none of them are accessible. And we found someone who had done a review of them and none of them were accessible. So I was really a little bit panicked because I thought, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this huge corpus of data. So one of the features so this was really making my own access journey in lots of ways. One of the things that Kurzweil does really well is allows you to annotate in texts. So I was sitting down and thinking one day, I still wanted to work with the recordings. I knew that Kurzweil could take a PDF document and convert it to an MP4 or an MP3, so that if someone wanted to have, their podcast version of their reading to go for a walk, they could do that. Or if just listening in that format was easier, they could do that. I started to wonder, if I can annotate in a text, I wonder if I can annotate in a recording. So I called Kurzweil, and this was so interesting because nobody had the answer. They didn't know. So it was not a feature of Kurzweil that they advertised. It was not anything that was out there, but it was possible. So they said, well, let me go and check this out and get back to you. So they came back to me and they said, yeah, it turns out you can basically insert a bookmark or annotation directly into the recording. And then when I read the annotation and click on it, it'll take me to that spot in the recording. So that was another game changer that really made access possible to my data. It made analysis possible. So this was how I did it. I sort of partially transcribed, and then when I was going to get quotes from my data, I went directly into the recording and got the quotes, which had the added advantage of reconnecting me with those voices that had been so important to me in our conversations, because it's how I orient to the world is auditorially. So this was huge, and it was a real case of having to make my own access. Interestingly, it turned out to probably be one of the more significant contributions for my dissertation, which my external examiner actually pointed out, and then sent me this call for book chapters after. So I've got a chapter out that's called Blind Methodologies. It was all about how I work auditorially with data and do that analysis. So it was kind of an aspect of access that I had not thought about. Okay, next slide. So some of my best friends are librarians. Not a lie. The image on the screen is the book cover of Tanya Tchaikovsky's The Question of Access. So, and I'll talk a little bit about her theorizing in a little bit, but essentially Tanya theorizes access as relational. And I often experience access as transactional. And her work really underpinned my analysis, the analysis of my data, her work along with another scholar named Fiona Kumari Campbell, who theorizes ableism in a post-structural way. So her work was really important. So as you can imagine, when work is really important to you, you tend to quote it. So I did all through my dissertation. And I put page numbers, I thought. So send my dissertation off to the external examiner, who happened to be Tanya Tchaikovsky. And it comes back with really good reports, which points out that all my page numbers of her book are wrong. And I thought, oh no. Turns out that in a Kindle book, which in and of itself represented a huge access win, that I could get this Kindle academic book and easily read it, didn't have page numbers, it had location numbers. Turns out that those location numbers change depending on what device you're on. I had no idea. So I'm literally sort of staring down the barrel of defense, probably 2 weeks out, not even 2 weeks out. And I was right up against the hard deadline of submitting the final version for graduation. And I had to figure out how to cite all of this. So we looked up the citation, and sure enough, I had to cite chapter, section, paragraph number. Jen will remember this. Yeah, can't scroll by any of those in a Kindle book using a screen reader. So there was no way for me to do that. So Panic-stricken, I'm reaching out to my librarian friends saying, I don't know how to do this. And I have a ton of them. Like, it made me realize I also had a number of others that were wrong. They just didn't happen to be on my advisory, but they weren't my external examiners, right? So I had to go through all of them and change them. And so I reached out to the librarians, and the person who stepped up and said, well, I'll come and do this with you was Jen Richard, who saved my life. But we spent, I'm going to say 5 hours, Jen. 5 hours, yeah. Literally 5 hours with me searching every quote, Jen sitting beside me with her iPad, searching for the sentence, and then going back to the beginning of the chapter and counting sections and paragraphs. So this was an epic fail, but it was sort of the beginning in lots of ways of me realizing why some of my best friends are librarians. And it really, I think, was also the beginning of me understanding that, in fact, in my academic context, that librarians might be the people who think about access almost as much as I do, maybe in different ways, but I think in ways that helped me think about how you get other people to talk about access as part of their work. All right. Next slide. So over to you for just a second. I'm going to make you work for just a minute. And I've got 3 questions on the slide. What does access mean to you? And I'm genuinely curious. How do you engage with it in your work/life? When and how does access become something for you to consider? What does it mean to you, access? You can just yell out an answer if you have one.
Okay, well, I'm willing to give it a go. I think that librarians often think about access in terms of whether something costs money to access or not.
Ah,
So open access is obviously one of the things that a lot of folks in this room have worked on for
Yep.
most of their careers. And so for me, when I think about access, it often means, is this document publicly available online for people to use without paying for it? That's probably from my perspective.
yeah.
One of the big
And
things.
thanks for that. So interesting, because so much of the access discussion that goes on in my world is also very much about money, right? Except that it's how much is it going to cost us to make sure we're accessible? That's the frequent discussion. There was someone over here.
Well, my name's Andre Tessier. I'm from Claravate. And as a vendor, we often, when we're working with institutions, we need to answer the question of accessibility. It comes up all the time. And I initially had said it's about leveling the play field for everyone so that we have equality across academia and indeed everywhere in life. So for us as a vendor, we need to invest in accessibility. And we're lucky in that we have standards by which we can follow and do our work. We work with third parties to try and make our solutions better. I think one thing we don't maybe see enough of is this type of discussion where we can engage directly with folks with accessibility issues so that we can learn more about their experience. And I think that's what I'm learning today.
Ah, yeah. See, you need us too. Yeah. And so I love hearing that accessibility is investment. I don't hear that frequently, I'm going to say. And I will probably point out that, in fact, we are 30 years behind the US in legislation. So the ADA came into being in 1991, I think 1992, it might have been ratified. We're just engaging now. So I think that we often only engage with issues of access when they're raised by somebody who is experiencing inaccessibility. It's not something we always pay attention to. I'm going to suggest that's maybe a little bit different for librarians. I feel like librarians think more than the general public, more than maybe other academic departments about access. It's been my experience that is true.
Margaret?
So my background is a software developer, and then I became a librarian. And when I tend to think of access, I'm thinking about providing access digitally for maybe like archival material or collections, special
Oh, yeah.
collections that we may have, and making it available to the broader public. But I'm definitely ashamed to say that I have not really considered like accessibility for people that are that are different than like with vision impaired and um yeah, so like I'm just thinking more about people like me who
Right.
can go and engage with like the digital materials and
Right.
OCR, like just that we don't have to worry as much about OCR and optical character recognition when you're looking at handwriting and
Right. And it's trickier with archival material, right? That's a whole other level of consideration of access, particularly around assistive technology. It's really, really tricky. And I think it's common. I'm always I actually often hear folks talk about that and say, gosh, I'm ashamed to think that I haven't thought about that. I think I'm at that stage where I'm hoping folks can move past feeling ashamed to just being open to discussion, which is, I'm always happy to work with folks who want to learn. That's the kind of work that I like doing actually the most. So I do want to move on to the next slide because I'm sort of a little conscious of time. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit my lifelong engagement of access. So I've talked about it specific to technology in lots of ways. Much of my life in all kinds of ways have been related to contending with issues of access. So access to and within spaces, and even my move to Montreal is showing me all kinds of new ways that I'm contending with that. Just learning to get around campus because all of a sudden I'm in a large city with an increasing proliferation of electric vehicles that I can't hear. And we've always been taught to listen to traffic patterns. I've learned that cyclists in Montreal don't tend to observe intersections. And I can't hear them coming. So I've had to contend in lots of ways with a level of danger that I'm sort of not used to thinking about coming from small town Nova Scotia. So that's been new and prevalent in my thinking. Access to and within learning environments. And lots of times that's been about technology, but lots of times it's not about technology. It's about whether the folks I'm with are interested at all in making space for who I am and how I work and what that might do to normative teaching and learning routines. But it's also been around technology when, for example, folks choose pedagogically to do an online class using nothing but chat. So facilitating, it seems silly to think about, but somebody once facilitated a whole doctoral discussion using the chat. I gave up. I couldn't keep up. And it was one of those chats where every time somebody put a new chat message in, it bumped everything down. So it just my cursor was bouncing all over the place and I was not able to participate at all. So, those kinds of frustrations within both digital and face-to-face learning spaces have been often what I'm dealing with. Access to information, that's a big one. In lots of ways, that's been where my engagement with librarians comes in, but also government documents. Trying to get accessible PDF versions of things is often still a challenge. Folks don't don't pay attention to OCR and making sure that it's not simply an image. So that's often what I contend with. And then access to and through technology. So making sure I have access to the most up-to-date version of my screen reader is actually really critical because every time the university, for example, updates my system, something new, it introduces a new access challenge almost always. Every time Zoom updates, then I have a new access challenge, like something always pops up that the screen readers haven't been able to keep up with. So it's an everyday challenge, engagement, I would say. Every time I change jobs, there's something new. So, you know, one of the things I didn't really think a lot about moving into the chair role was that I have to do things like approve expense reports. Those systems are almost never terribly accessible. They are developing apps. And what I love about that is that the apps tend to really simplify what's a very overly complicated system in its original sort of desktop web version. I don't know the technical language for that. So I have found the apps do help, but I'm always running into something new. And always shocked when things like taking the equity training that I'm supposed to take in order to serve on a hiring committee it's impossible for me to get into. I can't access it because the screen reader won't read the button to even enter the course. So that happened last year. Interestingly, participated in a Moodle workshop or a pilot project where they were bringing in an accessibility checker. So I don't know if some of folks have heard of this, but it's called the Brickfield Accessibility Checker, and we were piloting it. And it's great for checking the accessibility of everything you put on a Moodle site. Interestingly, not accessible from the faculty user end. So all of the ways that they do not anticipate faculty members to be blind was, I'd like to say, astonishing, but not so much. Okay, next slide, please. So then often my experience with access comes in many shapes and forms. Often it's been that access is something I have or don't have. So it's sort of black and white. Something I must request through often complicated bureaucratic procedures, lots of paperwork. Something I'm required to provide proof of disability to acquire. So when I was 43 going back to do my PhD, I ran out of my office one day and they said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to prove I'm still blind." They have it on record, but I got to prove it again. And it's something that can and often is denied. I see this frequently with students. I have certainly experienced it in my life in really egregious ways, for sure, where faculty have blatantly told me I wouldn't be allowed to impose my disability on my class, but in all kinds of other really small ways that indicate to me, for example, I'm too expensive and that my departmental budget can't handle it. So ultimately then, in lots of ways, my access becomes contingent on the goodwill of others. And so I would say that one of the reasons I tend to say some of my best friends are librarians is because they engage with all of my access issues in ways that tell me it's their job, not that it's something kind they're doing. Next slide, please. So then why am I researching access? That seems like an obvious question, right? Why am I researching access? Why am I just not going on to something else? Like my life might be a lot easier if I didn't, eat, sleep, drink, teach, research, advocate, all of this. And yet I find it really interesting and really important. So one of the reasons that I choose to research access and work in this domain is that I think our understanding of access is underdeveloped and oversimplified. So we falsely equate, for example, and I hear this all the time, accommodation with accessibility. So when I talk with folks about what we need to do to be accessible institutions or accessible departments or have accessible courses, they'll say, "Oh, we just need to make sure that all the accommodations are in place." And they're often shocked when I say, that the fact that we have to accommodate means that we are inaccessible. And if we design accessibly, it will greatly reduce the need to accommodate. And that seems to be news to lots of people who come into it with goodwill and a good heart and wanting to do the right thing. But we've just been led to believe that because the human rights codes say we have a right to accommodation, that accommodation means we're accessible. We tend to situate access as a service, and I think this is why I talk about it as the transactional, because we talk about it as a service we deliver, and sometimes it is. I think accessibility services are important, like ASL and LSQ interpretation. That's a service. It is about accessibility and ensuring accessibility. Captioning is a service, but there are all kinds of things that are not about service. They're about good pedagogy. They're about accessible collections. They're about accessible websites. So we think about it in sort of transactional service-oriented way, and we tend not to always think about it as a right. I think we become complacent about our failures to center access as an essential institutional and societal conversation. So it's an afterthought. So we don't plan with accessibility in mind, and we actually think that that's often okay. Okay, so next slide, please. So I'm going to go back to Tanya Tchaikovsky's work a little bit because it's been so, I think it's pivotal for my research, but it's also been really important for helping me think through how I do my work and how I engage with people. So she takes access out of the realm of transaction and really kind of talks about it as space. And the politics of wonder is kind of how we engage in that space. So she says that access is a complex form of perception that organizes socio-political relations between people in social space. In Canada, she says, processes of inclusion and therefore access can arise only insofar as exclusion has already become an issue and is already perceivable. And so she calls us to study what has been said and done already in the name of access so that we might approach it differently. So she's wanting us to engage in lots of ways in issues of access so that we can think about what we're doing and how we might do it differently, not so we can just think about how to solve a particular problem that's in front of us, because if we do that, we're always going to be catching up. So interestingly, I went to cite this quote from my Kindle book this morning or yesterday and still couldn't. It was at position number 55 on my iPhone, but if Jen opens it up on her iPad, it probably won't be there. So next, please. So defining access. So I got a little bit curious, partly because of Tanya's definition of access, and she really prompts me to think about access as a space where I kind of come into contact with people and environments who send me all kinds of messages about whether I belong or not. And I was at McGill last week doing a session with graduate music students about, what it might take to have a welcoming, inclusive music school. And part of what we were trying to do was, start off our discussions with the definition of access, which I assumed would be easy to find. Strange that I didn't know in the work that I do that it wasn't. So I just sort of did a quick Google search. And the Oxford Learners, language learners site defined it as the opportunity or right to use something or see something / somebody. And so they provide examples and say, you need a password to gain access to the computer system. So that's just, again, you need a password, you're going to ask it for it, I'm going to give it to you, you're going to follow instructions and set it up. It, for me, was transactional. To provide or allow access. So that was another way they defined it, to something or somebody, which for me was interesting because that was about power, transaction, permission, all of those interesting things. And then to restrict or block access to something or somebody, which is often people's experiences of access in lots of settings, that it's either, deliberately or kind of covertly blocked. So next page, please, or next slide. So then defining accessibility. So I did the same Google search and came up with the following from the same site. So accessibility was defined as how easy something is to reach, enter, use, see, etc. So accessibility to computers is vital. I think we all know that these days. How easy something is to reach, enter, use, etc. for someone with a disability. And so they just sort of tagged us on to that general definition. But what was interesting for me here was the example. The building has limited accessibility. So clearly we're starting from the position that exclusion is already perceivable and in place. Or this checklist will help you evaluate the accessibility of a building. So interesting for me that these are sort of grounded in assumptions that accessibility doesn't exist. And it's something we're going to have to remediate or at least check on. Next slide, please. So then I went to the legislation, so the Accessible Canada Act, and I did look at Nova Scotia's Accessibility Act as well, and pretty much found the same thing, assuming that in legislation that you have to define things. I can't believe I didn't really look at this carefully before. So what I found is that in general terms, they talk about accessibility in terms of barriers. So the identification, prevention, and removal of barriers. And that's sort of the only way they define access. They do go into much greater detail in the Accessible Canada Act to define disability. So disability means any impairment, including a physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment, or functional limitation, whether permanent, episodic, or temporary in nature, or evident or not, that in interaction with a barrier hinders a person's full and equal participation in society. And that's from the Accessible Canada Act. So the only hint at relationship here really is between barriers and disabilities. And it's those interactions that kind of prevent participation, and there's just no human element. So I find that really sad and interesting and all of those things. So next slide, please. So then I went to Concordia, which is my home institution, to see what we were doing, because I was aware that unlike a lot of institutions, we actually have an accessibility policy for students, faculty, and staff, and that's actually rare. We have a proliferation of them across the country for students, and we tend not to think about it for faculty and staff because we're not the folks who are expected in the ranks of faculty and staff. So I found this definition in our policy. Accessibility means product, device, service, or environment which is available to as many people as possible. Accessibility is concerned with inclusiveness and barrier-free design, including the identification, prevention, and removal of barriers. So there they are again. Accessibility can be viewed as persons' access to and benefit from a system or entity in a way that upholds principles of dignity, independence, and I might argue with that one, integration, and equality of opportunity. So I'm happy that we actually had a definition, because I think it really highlights that we thought about it. And it's not the we that I was not involved in this, but I think as an institution, it does mean we're thinking about this. But it's still largely depersonalized. It actually highlights independence, which can be problematic because it actually leads us to think that asking for help is something we should not be doing and that it's burdensome for others. So that's for our policy. Next slide. So disability and self-advocacy, this got me thinking back to my research, my doctoral research, which really looked at experiences of self-advocacy. And I interviewed 30 disabled students and then 15 faculty members who students had recommended as being quite supportive of their learning. And when I looked, for example, at the literature, but mostly at websites, I learned that self-advocacy is generally defined as a skill related to the ability to disclose your disability, understand and articulate your needs, and in some cases, navigate faculty personalities. That's disturbing to have in a definition from my perspective. It certainly highlights how relational it is and how precarious it is. So in lots of ways, what we found is that it's self-advocacy has become a condition of access, something that you have to demonstrate in order to get access to anything in post-secondary accessibility contexts. And it's a repeated requirement that sends clear messages about who belongs at university and who doesn't, who is expected and who isn't, whose learning is centered and whose learning is not centered. In other words, who has access and who has to request it. Next slide. Oh, 3 minutes. Wow. Okay. So according to my participants on this next slide for self-advocacy expects us to create our own access by providing proof of need, agreeing to specifically defined approved accommodations, and following all required steps to ensure accommodations are in place. You have to know your rights, but you also have to know the responsibilities of others. And you have to have what is sometimes an unreasonable level of self-knowledge in the post-secondary environment. Next slide. So for me, diversity is really essential in my work to the cultivation of a sense of belonging. And it's why I work to amplify disabled voices and minoritized voices in general, and to expose ableism and inequity. Because I'm hopeful that it will create capacity for transformation. It's important to engage with knowledge and experiences and perspectives, I think, that challenge me to do things differently, not just others. It's not only my role to change. And they're also the things that I look for in my environment. And I think it's what's led me to think differently about how I engage in my environments, because I'm really interested in how people respond now to access requests. So as much as I hate it when I show up and things aren't accessible, I'm now observing more how people respond in ways that tell me they are welcoming, that they tell me that it is a priority for them. Okay, next slide. So working in allyship is something that we talk about a lot now. And it's defined as working for the rights of a minority group or marginalized group when you aren't a member. And it's what we talk about. We often claim it, which is problematic. But it does help us think about some tangible ways that we can make a difference in environments that tend to be ableist, exclusionary, discriminatory, and that a lot of access issues tend to exist in. So next slide. I really want us to think about working in solidarity, and this will probably expose my union work as well. Because solidarity is more about unity or agreement of feeling or action, especially among individuals with a common interest. And I want access to be our common interest. I don't want it to be my interest that you simply decide to support. So I want it to be about our mutual interest in access across institutions. Next slide, Jen. Okay. So listening, learning, and acting, and I just have a couple of examples of how that's shown up. So proactively reducing the significant additional labor is so often required to ensure access. And Acadia actually has done an amazing job at this in the way that their librarians facilitate access to digital texts for students, and cut down the extensive labor that students often have to expend, and faculty. They did this frequently for me as a faculty member when I got, for example, a DRM version of a book that I couldn't read. So it was fantastic. Proactively attending to and working to remediate known enduring accessibility issues. So Laurier's library, for example, has a document remediation, PDF remediation service, and they will really help us sort out. I do some work with Mark Weiler at Laurier, who has been a real champion for the importance of access being our common issue, so that they help us remediate the things like finding page numbers, which isn't only an issue in those Kindle books, but also in PDF versions of articles. Declutter and simplify the web page. This I found when I was looking for the Bookshare thing on Acadia's website, and noticed their incredibly revamped website, which is so easy to navigate because they designed it accessibly and had it audited. And it is so decluttered and so simplified to use. And I find often library websites are not. So it's an easy, important thing to do that will make a massive difference. Easy in terms of being tangible, but it certainly is work. So the last slide is be curious. Be curious about how you can become increasingly more accessible. Be ready to hear difficult feedback because you'll get it. And be ready to change how you do things. Be committed to getting it right, because access is not a destination. It's an ongoing everyday act. And that, my friends, is it. Thank you so much for listening and for engaging.
Yeah, thanks.
Cynthia, I think we
That's
have,
Cynthia.
sorry, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions.
Okay, I was gonna say, I kind of ran out the clock. Apologies. Any questions? Is there an online question? Great.
This is a question from Zoom from Jennifer Trower.
Hi.
Are the existing standards, WCAG, sufficient to really enable equal access? Are only the minimum requirements being met?
Is the standard sufficient? So I think the standard is good. I think what the standard doesn't take into account is usability. So we need to design according to the standards, but we also need to engage with users who will tell us whether the way we're designing is actually usable. I would say in many cases, though, the minimum standards are only being met unless people really commit significantly to it. And I'm not sure folks are widely aware of the standards yet.
Cynthia, I wanted to ask you a question about textbooks. I don't know whether you use textbooks in your teaching, but
I do.
for years, my experience has been that the large publishers were deliberately trying to make their materials inaccessible, publishing them in colors that couldn't be photocopied,
Right.
laying out for visual learners, which can be very effective, but can be a nightmare for a screen reader.
Yeah.
Are they getting with the program yet? The publishers.
Slowly. Some of them still, so I find actually the ebook platforms, for example, that the librarians often use, or the libraries often use or have access to, are actually still really difficult. So I generally find I need something that's downloadable that I can work with rather than trying to work with the web-based version. So I think that's getting better. I think it's really slow. I think some of the bigger publishers are getting better. I would say that Routledge and Sage are getting much better. I had an incident not many years ago where I was trying to access a digital version of a text from Peter Lang, strangely enough, in a disability studies and education series, and they had no accessible version. And I'm trying to remember who it was. It was Agnieszka Hayes from Acadia, who spent an inordinate amount of time trying to track down an accessible version of this text for me. So they're slow, very slow. And we're trying to get, and I'm working with a group, interestingly, of blind academics, students, postdocs, faculty members, and it's been really interesting because we're all in disciplines that span the sciences and the arts. And Mark Weiler, actually at Laurier, has been really instrumental in bringing us together, and it's been a real gift because it's hard to find your people. And so they've been doing some really interesting work around the issues of page numbers and issues around procurement. They're really looking a lot at procurement and accessible, being able to procure accessible resources at libraries. So I'm a big fan of open access. One of my favorite journals is the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, that's hosted at the University of Waterloo, because they really pay attention a lot to access. And Jay Dolmage has really made that a priority.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Cynthia, thank you so much
Thank
for a
you
really
so much.
thought-provoking
It's
presentation.
a
And
pleasure to be here. Have a fabulous day, everyone.
thank you.